Hello creative shrimps, Gleb Alexandrov here, welcome to yet another tutorial from the photogrammetry course. I'm pretty excited because in this video we'll explore the photogrammetry workflow, which is 100% open source and cross-platform. Before we begin, that's the software that we're gonna use, so feel free to download it. Darktable for pre-processing the raw files, Meshroom as our main photogrammetry tool for this tutorial, and Blender obviously as a multi-purpose 3D editing tool for cleaning up the mesh and baking textures. A quick disclaimer though, it might be not the most optimal photo scanning workflow. There are tools and applications that are simply faster than Meshroom and say more convenient than Blender when it comes to baking, but it's definitely the most accessible photogrammetry workflow at the moment, so let's get started. Here is a brief introduction to what the capturing process looked like. So we went to this abandoned post-Soviet hangar, found this amazing cellophane and pretty much shoot it from all possible angles while following the best practices of photogrammetry, mainly keeping the ISO at its lowest number, setting the f-stop to 8 to make sure everything is in focus, and then using tripod to calibrate the shutter speed as we like it. When shooting on tripod, the shutter speed can be any number we like, no shaky hands involved. But to stay on a safe side, we set the timer to 2 seconds as well to reduce the camera shake on pressing the button. That is pretty much it for the photo session. We have covered these settings extensively in the first chapter of the course. Oh, and we also took one photo of our X-Rite color checker gray card to be able to calibrate the white balance in post. The whole scan took 107 photos on Canon 80D with Sigma 17 to 55mm lens. The source photos as well as the blend files are available for download, so if you want to follow along with us, consider downloading these photos. Before starting the photogrammetry process, let's actually process the raw sources in Darktable, a free and open source software for developing the raw files. So right away, I'm gonna open the folder with all the photos that we have taken during the scanning session, and then I'm simply dragging it into the central window of Darktable. If you don't have the panel on the left, you can hit the triangle to open it up, and there we can check the metadata or the image information. There is a lot of interesting data in there. What were the camera settings? For example, f-stop was set to 8, apparently exposure at 1/2 of a second. The ISO is just 100, which is awesome. And it never hurts to double check if it's the raw file indeed, which it is. We can tell it by the CR2 format. On the right, we should also have the open panel with history stack and export settings. Right now we're in the light table mode, in which we simply preview all of our images, and we edit them in darkroom. You can access it by double-clicking on any image. Let it be the image with the gray card that will serve as a reference. Down in the Modules tab, I will activate all modules just for a second to showcase something. The thing we should watch for when developing the raw files in Darktable is whether the base curve has been disabled. Occasionally you may discover that some kind of a preset has been applied. These curves are similar to the in-camera processing that is applied automatically when you shoot in JPEGs. That's something that we should avoid when shooting in RAW, so here goes the reset button. We should keep the contrast curve linear or disable it altogether. Alright, now I'm visiting the Modules drop-down menu and selecting the Scene-Referred Workflow. That's the preset that contains all the modules that we'll need in this tutorial. And next I'm gonna check the tabs at the top of the shelf to make sure that pretty much all the modules have been disabled. And it seems like it is the case, except the Filmic RGB that should be also turned off, because it also implements a kind of a curve, and we should be suspicious about any kind of curves when developing our raw data for photogrammetry. In other words, we're trying to stick to the sensor values as close as we can and avoid the transformation that are meant for display. So to calibrate the colors and make them closer to the reference in the source photo, we should adjust the white balance first, the temperature slider. Thankfully, we have the gray card in our scene, so we can set the custom white balance with the help of such card. If you don't have a card though, don't despair. Try to find the area in the photo that is supposed to be as close to neutral gray as possible and select it, or it's always possible to eyeball it a little bit. So here we have the scene illuminant that is approximately 6K kelvins. What we can do next is adjust the exposure in a similar way. because we have the 18% gray card, and we can use the color picker tool in Darktable to read the lab values of these pixels right here. And this value, according to the specification of the X-Rite color checker, should read as 50 in the lab terms. To double down, we know it for a fact that if we want to align these values with the values of the color checker, which is our reference, it should read 50. So what I'm doing here is carefully nudging the exposure value to the right and then clicking on the color checker and checking again, increasing the exposure a bit more. 44, close enough to 50. Now I'm gonna enable the tone equalizer module to try to reduce the influence of the light sources on the scene. We can do it in two ways. We can, of course, adjust the sliders, like the 0 EV slider here, or we can hover the mouse cursor over some area of the image and use mouse wheel to adjust the sliders. Something like that. It's not a physically correct operation and it shouldn't replace a proper delighting, but that's a decent starting point for pre-processing photos for photogrammetry. I usually follow it up by switching the highlight reconstruction to reconstruct color. That's an additional measure to preserve some highlights that otherwise will get clipped. Alright, getting back to Lighttable where we have all our photos arranged. So we have adjusted this particular image. Now down in the history stack I'm pressing selective copy, making sure that the white balance is included. That's important. And pressing OK. Now Ctrl A to select all images at once, in the history stack selective paste, and happily confirm the operation. The adjustments made to the photo with the color checker should now propagate to the rest of the sources. It looks good to me, I think. Now we should be ready to export this batch of images out of Darktable, so I'm heading over to the Export tab, pressing the Browse icon. I've created two folders in advance, one for geometry and the other one for texture, and they are called like that: Meshroom Geometry, Meshroom Texture. I'll explain why in just a moment. So let's enter the texture folder, set it as the output destination, and now we should check two things. The first one is the output resolution, and I'm limiting it to 2500 pixels wide. Why do we do it though? Why not simply use the full resolution? Firstly, to reduce the processing times, secondly, to reduce the file size, and finally, and probably most importantly, we found out that prescaling the footage before feeding it into Meshroom leads to better results than using the higher downscale factors within Meshroom. And then we should check the file format, that should be 8-bit TIFF, and hit export then. After this batch of images meant for texturing have been exported, let's do another batch for geometry. Disclaimer, this step is not absolutely necessary. Meshroom will work just fine with just one set that we have prepared already. That being said, it's very useful to know how to prepare the split input for geometry and textures in Meshroom, so that's what we're gonna do. Double-click on any of the sources to enter the darkroom mode. This time I will prepare the more contrasted versions of the image, so tone equalizer set to off, the local contrast can be set to on instead. I will try to boost the overall sharpness and the amount of fine detail in the images. In theory, that should help Meshroom to reconstruct the better mesh. So let us also enable the sharpen effect, crank up the amount all the way to 2 to its maximal value. Not that the whole process wouldn't work without all these sharpening shenanigans, but anyway, it's useful to explore this branching workflow of feeding two types of sources to Meshroom. So once again, click on Lighttable to get back to our Lighttable tab with all the previews. Selectively copying all the settings, including white balance. Ctrl A to expand the selection to all photos, and then selective paste all modules onto them. Looks like the processing has been finished, so we just have to export it out to its separate folder. Clicking on the Browse icon, back to the folder. And now let's dump it into the Meshroom Geometry folder. It is important that the resolution or the size of the images line up with the previous folder, so 2500, and pressing the Export button. After pre-processing the raw files in Darktable, we should have two folders. The one with the images calibrated for texturing based on the reference gray card. Don't worry if it looks a little bit too flat and boring. It should look like this. it is meant for albedo textures. And here's the second one with the files aimed at reconstructing geometry, slightly sharpened, with boosted contrast and so on. Right, so we did all the pre-processing required for photogrammetry in Darktable, and now we can actually move on to Meshroom and start the photogrammetry process going.